Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Monday, April 15th, and we officially are past the end of the NBA regular season. So on that note, we're going to be diving into a whole bunch of playoff conversations today. We're going to start off with some Western and Eastern Conference previews, talk about how we got to this point, some of the key developments from this past weekend in the NBA, and additionally, we will be ending off the show by talking about some of the biggest storylines for the playoffs to come in the first round and moving forward. Whole lot of NBA talk for the day, but before we get into everything there, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us, help us grow this channel. And for any of our live viewers, if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be greatly appreciated. It is a huge help to us. I wanted to start the show by talking about the Western Conference because I think that the playoff bracket on that side is slightly more entertaining. There is maybe a little bit more parity, so we're going to be diving into the West to start this one off. We went into Sunday, the final day of the regular season, with a three-place tie for the first seed in the conference between the Oklahoma City Thunder, Denver Nuggets, and Minnesota Timberwolves. We saw the Thunder and the Nuggets cruise to victories, absolutely dominant from the Thunder. Didn't even look like a real score, really, in the NBA. Granted, Mavericks playing none of their starters in that one. But the Timberwolves actually ended up losing in a pretty concerning way to the Phoenix Suns, where the Suns were also playing for something as well. Both of these teams, you could probably argue that the Suns had more to gain/lose from that game than the Timberwolves, as they were trying to avoid the play-in tournament. So again, this is sort of just about the end of when you talk about the level of desperation. You can only manufacture so much pressure as it is. This is a very common conversation of who wants it more, yada yada, all that sort of sports jargon. But, you know, both of these teams were trying, and the Suns just pretty much took it to the Timberwolves. They built up a 22-point lead in the first quarter and carried it through the game. After that point, the lead had never dropped down to single digits. And like I said, it's not like the Timberwolves didn't care about this game, where they played all of their key players. Karl Anthony Towns, he was in his second game, I believe it was, since returning from injury. So still trying to work him back into everything as the playoffs ramp up. Maybe that was part of it for this game. Their offense did look a little bit sloppy, but again, as far as that competitive fire being there, it was. The Timberwolves, just at least on this day, were not on the same level as the Suns. You had a little bit of a scuffle between Bradley Beal and Devin Booker in the second quarter, where they were Bradley Beal and Anthony Edwards, that is, in the second quarter, where they got into a little bit of a shoving match and some animosity that could definitely lead into the playoff series where these two teams are actually set to play. So we will dive more into that specific matchup in a minute. But with that set of those three games, it is Oklahoma City as the 1 seed, Denver as the 2 seed, and Minnesota as the 3 seed. You have the Clippers and Mavericks in that 4-5 matchup. We've known that for about a week or so now. And then it was the Suns grabbing the 6th seed with their win. So play-in tournament here. You have the Pelicans versus the Lakers in the 7-8 matchup that will take place tomorrow night. The winner will go on to face the Denver Nuggets in the first round. The loser will play the winner of the 9-10 matchup in the Kings and Warriors for a chance to play the Thunder in the first round, which does sort of bring into this pretty interesting debate that's going on around the internet today surrounding specifically the Los Angeles Lakers and how they should approach this play-in tournament, where this was very much sort of circulated. I know that on ESPN earlier today, Mike Greenberg, who I do very much enjoy, but some of his basketball takes as of late have been pretty atrocious in my eyes. He said that he thought that the Lakers should sit everybody for their game against the Pelicans and gun for that 8 spot against the Oklahoma City Thunder. And in a perfect world, I'm sure that the Lakers would prefer to play the Thunder over the Nuggets. Who wouldn't really, especially given the amount of success that the Lakers have had against the Thunder this season. But this debate it's a massive risk in my eyes, where we have just seen the play-in tournament be implemented over the past few years. But that being said, in the history of the NBA, we've seen this sort of jockeying and playing the game of trying to manipulate what type of seed you are for matchups as the season winds down. I don't think you really have the flexibility to do that in the play-in tournament in these one-game series. And a sudden death, I think it's just so risky to play your odds of not making the playoffs entirely just to try and find the best possible matchup in the first round if you are the Lakers in this situation. And again, I fully admit that the Lakers have a much better chance to go deep in the playoffs if they face the Thunder in the first round as opposed to the Nuggets. And I have confidence that the Lakers would beat the Thunder in a series, but I also don't think that that's any sort of a guarantee. We did just see Anthony Davis dealing with some back spasms during their game yesterday as well. Not that I think it should be anything too serious, but again, just an example of nothing is really a given in the game of basketball, and that's even more the case when you're talking about a one-game instance where if the Lakers were to throw their game against the Pelicans, then they would be facing either the Sacramento Kings, who swept the Lakers during the regular season series, that little subplot of Domantas Sabonis being 10-0 against Anthony Davis in his career. I'm sure that would be talked about in this instance. And the other option would be having to play the Warriors. And anytime that you are playing Steph Curry in a one-game series, and now you can say the same thing for LeBron James, of course, but I just feel like you are really testing the limits of the basketball gods, purposefully losing in one game to try and position yourself when, as we know, the Lakers still, as much as their defense has shown improvements at times over the course of the year, I don't think that they have any of those elite point of attack defenders. And we've seen Anthony Davis at times struggle to, and it's not just an Anthony Davis or a Lakers thing. Figuring out how you want to play Steph Curry is an incredibly difficult position to be in. And we've just seen Curry be able to sort of take advantage of these instances at times during this iteration where it's Anthony Davis. Is he going to drop back into that drop coverage? Is he going to play up? And pull Anthony Davis, the team's best defender, away from the rim where he's at his best. Again, all these different elements. And again, it's just a situation there where I don't think you can throw a game in this type of a circumstance. I don't expect them to. We'll be curious to see whether or not the team does go with maybe from a precautionary side, but B, also to maybe try and see. I mean, you can make an argument too that this is a little bit of a win-win situation for the Lakers, where if they win their game against the Pelicans, they're in the playoffs. If they lose, they have a chance to make the playoffs with a more favorable matchup. But ultimately, again, I think you have to try. Let me know what you think about that situation in the comment section. But in terms of the Greater Western Conference picture here, it is still the Denver Nuggets who are the team to beat in the West. Now, they haven't looked quite as invincible, I think, as we felt about them for a while, but granted, we saw this last year specifically that I thought cost Jokic the MVP, was them take their foot off the gas a little bit as the season came down to the end, and that was not the case with the Nuggets this year. Yes, Jamal Murray missed a bunch of games there in order to try and preserve him for the playoffs, but Jokic was playing this whole way, and he was playing hard. But again, when I talk about some of the uncharacteristic losses for the Nuggets, that includes their game against the San Antonio Spurs on Friday, where Jokic was absolutely trying in this game, and it was Victor Wembanyama just putting on an incredible performance. Now, Wemby is going to be Wemby, and he's only going to get better. It's a shame that we're not going to be able to see any more of him until next NBA season. But again, this was another close game that they lost. They are 6-6 in games decided by 3 points or less. I think that that's a little bit of a dramatic stat to sort of throw out, as I do currently do so. But a handful of these have come in the past month or so, where it was that Spurs game. They lost a close one against the Clippers the other week. Granted, that was without Jamal Murray, and head coach Mike Malone was actually ejected from that game as well. The Nuggets win that game in my eyes if they have Jamal Murray. And then they lost on St. Patrick's Day to that Kyrie crazy left-handed hook shot as well. So, again, you can't overreact to these losses. I'm just pointing them out that it does typically feel like those are games that the Nuggets should normally win, and they weren't able to do so in this recent stretch. But the Nuggets are still, they have the second most clutch wins in the NBA this season, and they have the third best win percentage in clutch situations this year. So, take all of that information I just gave out for what you will. When they are fully healthy, Jokic and Murray are the best duo in the NBA, I think, in terms of their skill, but also the way that they are able to play off one another. When you're talking about ranking duos in their collective, obviously there's the skill of a Durant and Booker or a Kyrie and Luka, but I think that the two-man game, along with the individual talent of Jamal Murray and Jokic, and frankly, they're coming off of a championship. Maybe it's recency bias, but I just don't think that there is a better two-man game in the NBA, really. And when you're talking about this Nuggets team as a whole, no, maybe they don't have the level of depth quite like they did last year, but we've seen flashes, especially as of late, with both Peyton Watson and Christian Brown. Again, they just need these supplementary pieces to stick up and play big minutes. That also being along with the fact that them and the Celtics are really the two teams that you can make an argument, in my eyes, for the best starting five in the NBA. So the Nuggets are they are the betting favorites. They are the team that many, including myself, are going to pick to come out of the Western Conference this year. And I think that they should come out. I just also think that there are a handful of very competitive teams in the Western Conference that could make things interesting, so I'll be curious to see how that plays out. But as for the rest of the Western Conference here, the Thunder have had an incredible season, one of the youngest teams to ever take home the 1 seed in NBA history, and there's so much that is going on for them. Again, I don't like the conversation of them necessarily being a write-off in the first round, should it be the Lakers or anybody else that comes in as the 8th seed. They do definitely scream a little bit of a first-round upset, but at the same time, this is an extremely hungry group. You know that they are not ready to be counted out. Now, some of those matchups when it comes to size and the post game and the physicality of the playoffs, the Thunder haven't had, they don't really have. I know that Chet Holmgren is incredible, had a rookie of the year caliber season in basically any year where Victor Wembanyama isn't in that same class, but They don't really have depth at the position, and yes, they have a lot of flexibility and a lot of depth, but in general, that is. But the big position is one that I do worry about a little bit with the Thunder, and there are some teams that could possibly take advantage of that, but going to be curious to see how the matchups lay out there, because I'm definitely not ready to fully write them off. I would probably, pick against them in terms of, are they going to make the Western Conference Finals? But that being said, gonna have to see who they're facing off against in the first round. And then as far as that 3-6 matchup that I alluded to, Timberwolves versus Suns, where it is a very interesting matchup. Really hard to sort of, come up with a definitive feeling on the Phoenix Suns based off of the season they had, where, I gave my segment, it was a couple months ago, of have the Suns rounded the corner. They look to be one of the best 4 teams in the league, and then they just sort of staggered their way into falling into that play-in tournament threshold. Now, granted, still 16 games over 500, so it's not like at any point, and I was even trying to find the specific turning point of when things went wrong for them, and you just couldn't necessarily find. It was just these problems, specifically the fourth quarter, specifically the ball movement with them, and not having a true point guard to operate the show for them. They have been a very solid team the whole year, but just have had some glaring issues that makes people not feel great about them. But they ended up closing the season on a very good stretch, winning 7 of their last 10 games, and that's especially, significant considering their last 10 games were all against opponents that are in the playoff picture. Now, injuries definitely played at least somewhat of a role in how all of that played out, but still coming off of a little bit of a high note, and that game against the Timberwolves where they've just owned that matchup all year, swept them in the season series 3-0, and I understand that in terms of team success and a lot of these regular season series, it's never meant less when it comes to playoff implications, really. But you do also look at sort of the way that the Suns have won all of these matchups against the Timberwolves, where Anthony Edwards played in every single game and was significantly the worst version of himself, basically as he was all season, where he averaged just 14.3 points per game against the Suns this season in 3 games. He, of course, averaged 25.9 during the regular season, so an extremely dramatic fall off. Shot just 31% from the field as opposed to the 46% he shot in the regular season as a whole, and the Suns really were just comfortable of sending everything at Anthony Edwards and letting the others hurt them. This is a scenario where Karl Anthony Towns, what version of him are we going to get moving forward here? Because they are going to need that secondary creator. And while I am a fan of Naz Reid, he isn't necessarily the same level of dangerous in terms of creating with the ball in his hands by himself. Reid is an incredible supplemental player. If it weren't for the fact that he was started all these games down the stretch of the season, he's in the conversation for 6th man of the year. I wouldn't pick him. We're going to be doing our NBA awards tomorrow, but again, I think that there's just a lot of limitations surrounding some of the ball handlers on Minnesota, and Anthony Edwards is going to need to step up. And if Phoenix is looking to apply that heavy pressure to him in particular, what version of Karl Anthony Towns are we going to get? So as things currently stand, I think I'm going to lean with the Timberwolves in this series, but I don't feel great about it necessarily. I'm going to pick the Nuggets over whoever they end up playing in their series. Thunder I'm going to have to see, because I do think that the Lakers would be a very tough matchup. And then finally the Clippers versus the Mavericks, where it's been this iteration of, I mean, there's been a rivalry a little bit. Everybody says that Luka owns the LA Clippers and he's been a mismatch problem, but the two times that he has faced off against the Clippers in the playoffs, he has come up short. Now, when I say he has come up short, really it's the Mavericks as a whole came up short in both of those series because Luka was incredible, but he didn't have the level of help that I do believe he has this season, and Kyrie adding this other option, I think that there's a real chance that the two of them could cause fits for the Clippers defense, which has been very shaky since the All-Star break when they were really emerging as one of the top contenders as well. Now, if the Clippers are fully healthy, it is, it's going to be interesting to see because we haven't gotten one of those Kawhi Leonard playoff series probably really since he played the Mavericks, and I'm trying to remember which one was the more impressive one out of 2020 and 2021, but that's really the last time I remember seeing that elite level of Kawhi in postseason play. And I love Kawhi Leonard based off of his play style, his ability to do it on both ways. Clippers, it's hard to sort of count them out either, but I do think that I would go with the Mavericks in this type of a matchup. I believe that they are more capable of winning a shootout. It's going to come down to, can the Clippers, sort of this team that has looked, I would say to some degree, a little bit disengaged over the past couple months where they showed that elite stretch of January, February, and all of these veteran players who know that they can get it done in the biggest moments, but have also been held back a lot over recent years. So we'll see. I'm going to pick the Mavericks, but this is another scenario where 4-5 matchup, always going to be a close one. And I think that the Clippers can make things interesting, but I'm going to go with the Mavericks in this type of a matchup. So again, I know I copped out a little bit with that Thunder pick, but for the most part, I have the Nuggets moving on, I have the Mavericks moving on, and I have the Timberwolves a little bit begrudgingly, but we will see as all of this plays out. Again, those first set of Western Conference play-in tournament games kick off tomorrow night, so we'll probably we will get more in depth on those as they come. But for now, we are going to be taking our first break, and when we come back, we're going to be diving into the East. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about the Western Conference for the playoff picture here. Now we're going to be looking at the East and previewing that. So just starting top to bottom here in terms of seeding, it is the Boston Celtics as the 1 seed. We've known this for about a month or so. A commanding 14-game lead over the 2 seed that is actually not the Milwaukee Bucks like it was headed into yesterday's final set of regular season games, as the Bucks end up losing to the Magic, opening the door for the New York Knicks to steal that 2 seed, guarantee themselves home court advantage for the first 2 rounds when they won in an overtime game against the Bulls. That was a thriller, to say the least. We'll dive more into that in the third segment, but a little bit of a shakeup there on the final day of the regular season. Knicks take the 2 seed, Bucks at the 3 seed. You had the Cavs and the Magic as the 4-5 matchup. And then the Pacers escape falling into the play-in tournament. The 76ers putting together a big performance yesterday against the Nets. Had a chance to steal that 6th seed and get out of the play-in tournament. But the Pacers just poured it on Atlanta yesterday. Put up 157 points in regulation to take that one. And they will be headed to Milwaukee to play the Bucks in what should be a very interesting series there, where we have the Bucks sort of limping into their postseason play, and this is a matchup we've seen from really since the play-in tournament, the level of animosity and just the lack of fear that Indiana has, especially when it comes to this matchup against Milwaukee. There was the whole stolen ball incident that took place after Giannis's 60 whatever points that he scored in Indiana, and I think that should be a very charged up matchup, both from the level of play but some of the antics that could potentially go on in that series as well. As far as the play-in tournament, we have the 76ers versus the Miami Heat. I believe that game kicks off on Wednesday night, and then it is going to be the Hawks going into Chicago to face the Bulls, who I think that when you're looking at this play-in tournament, it's probably going to be the 76ers and Heat coming out of it. Now, the Bulls are a little bit interesting because they are very much mediocre, 39 and 43, so as far as their roster themselves, you can say they're below average. But the Bulls are one of those teams that do definitely play teams close. They have played in, I think now it's 11 overtime games this season. I think it was 10 headed into yesterday when they faced off against the Knicks, but Bulls, a very interesting team. I know that they were missing the likes of Ayo Dosunmu. I'm not sure if he would be back for them. I believe Andre Drummond is going to be out. I know Alex Caruso is dealing with a foot injury, so I would definitely bet against the Bulls. I wouldn't say definitely bet against the Bulls. In terms of betting-wise, if you're putting actual money on the line, I would just stay away from any game that the Bulls are a part of whatsoever, even though I do definitely like them over the Hawks in that 9-10 matchup. But all that to be said, I believe it's going to be Philadelphia and Miami coming out of the play-in tournament. I feel like it's probably going to be the 76ers beating the Heat in that 7-8 matchup, where Philly is coming off of 8 straight wins in that stretch. They beat the Miami Heat in Miami about a week or so ago. Now, that game was without Tyler Hero. He is returned, and I mean, he absolutely provides a level of offensive creation that the Heat desperately needed, at least in that matchup in particular, where the Heat went, it was a stretch of over 6 minutes in the fourth quarter where they didn't hit an actual field goal attempt, and really they just weren't able to get any types of good looks. Tyler Hero, I do think, makes the offense flow easier for Miami, both for himself and just the spacing of the team as a whole. Now, I know that Kevin Love actually did leave with an injury during their game yesterday. I'm not sure what the current status is. We can definitely look into that and keep you informed as we move forward here in the next coming days. We'll probably put a short out at some point but he was dealing with an upper arm contusion in the team's game against Toronto yesterday. So not sure what the status is going to be with him, but he has also been a very important part of a lot of these fourth quarters and second halves in general for Miami as of late. Still waiting on that sort of Jimmy Butler, erupting, that sleeping giant in himself, but he also just has not looked 100% himself. And again, I'm going to stop myself after this last statement because I feel like Butler is somebody who is just waiting to make people like myself look stupid when the postseason comes around, and he takes his game to that next level, at least in the beginning stages of it. But I would expect it's going to be Philadelphia as the 7 seed to go on to play the Knicks, and I think it's going to be the Heat playing the Celtics in an Eastern Conference Finals rematch from last year. Now, in terms of the series that I think will be most interesting, again, the Celtics, for as great of a regular season they had, most wins in the league with 64, either one of these matchups against Philly or Miami would be compelling. The Celtics should win in either of these circumstances, considering if you're just looking at this regular season and how the teams have looked. But that being said, there is definitely a mental aspect when it comes to this of we've seen the Heat knock off the Celtics in two of the past 3 Eastern Conference Finals that they've faced off in. And I think that it is a very interesting matchup there. The Knicks are a team here as the 2 seed that this is pretty great for them to end up in this type of a situation where now that they're the 2 seed, they have control over their side of the Eastern Conference bracket and should be very promising. I like their chances against both Philadelphia and Miami. We will dive into that a little bit more as the show moves on here, but a team that can win these defensive matchups such as Miami can, but they have that level of offensive creation from Jalen Brunson, who, if you watch the Knicks game yesterday, Doris Burke, I believe, was the one on the call, and she was very heavily arguing for Brunson being a first-team All-NBA member, which I think I disagree with, but it is an interesting conversation based off of the level of offensive scoring that he has provided for the Knicks this season, despite all of the injuries that they were dealing with. Bill Simmons and Ryan Russillo of The Ringer put out a podcast and sort of compared it to the Isaiah Thomas season from 17-18, I believe it was, where he was averaging 30 points per game. During the final stretches of the season, it was him just creating everything. But it's not just that. I do like the way that the Knicks as a core have really developed here, with Dante DiVincenzo being one of the best 3-and-D guys in the league. They have Josh Hart as well, a premier glue guy, and OG Anunoby being able to guard just about anybody. So the Knicks do have a lot of different looks that they can throw at a team, and I like how they match up in the first round. And then in the second round, they'll get the winner of Milwaukee and Indiana. Neither of those teams are particularly great on the defensive side of the ball as well. So, and having home court advantage where they are a very successful home team this season at 27-14. They also strip Milwaukee, if that should be the matchup, of home court advantage, where the Bucks are the second best team at home during the regular season, and take things into Madison Square Garden, which should make for a very interesting matchup as well. And just being able to avoid the Celtics until the Eastern Conference Finals. And I can tell you the Knicks definitely aren't scared of the Celtics, for as much as the Celtics were able to handle the Knicks in the regular season series. The Knicks, I don't think, had OG Anunoby for any one of these games. He's somebody who definitely does scream as somebody who could be a defender that could really take Jason Tatum out of the game. And once that happens, are we going to see the level of stagnancy that we've seen with the Celtics in recent years? So should be very interesting there. I guess final thoughts here on the last two series that are currently in place. The Bucks and the Pacers, like I alluded to, should be a very interesting series where the Bucks are definitely not playing their best level of basketball. I talked before on the show about how Milwaukee has at least had the one sort of thing going for them as of late, and that Damian Lillard has been able to really show up in these non-Giannis games. But over the weekend, almost immediately, Lillard sort of proved me wrong, where yesterday he went 2 of 14 from the field, and that is just sort of the reality of this Damian Lillard situation, where I just feel like he is incredibly unpredictable and inconsistent. He's, of course, a great player, but and this is something we're going to talk about a bunch as the show goes on here, but sort of the pressure around this Bucks organization as a whole to succeed, where Indiana is a little bit playing with house money, where they're this young up-and-coming team. They're a ton of fun, the best scoring offense in the league, and they are definitely not scared of anybody. They have this level of irrational confidence where they feel like they can go into Milwaukee and they can just run laps on them offensively. I'm sure this is a situation where the Bucks transition defense has really struggled this season. Indiana loves to run make or miss from the opponent. They are looking for chances as soon as they get them, and they're pretty unique in that sense, where I feel like they play that style definitely more than anybody else in the league does. I believe they're still number one in pace in the NBA, the Pacers are, and that's something that is going to tire out, especially when you're looking at a team in Milwaukee that did just lose Giannis to a calf injury. We don't know when he's going to be back. He's been almost superhuman in the way that he's been able to return to the playoffs after suffering some big injuries in the past, last year against Miami and against Atlanta during the conference finals in 2021, to then come into the finals against Phoenix and dominate them the way that he did. But calf injury is definitely very risky. We talked about this before. This is, a lot of fans are drawing similarities to the Kevin Durant injuries that he suffered in 2019 when he went out in the second round with a calf injury, tried to force himself back into it in the finals, and ended up tearing his Achilles in that same leg. It is a very scary thing. We want to make sure that Giannis is, playing this game as long as he possibly can, and it's just a wrinkle that Milwaukee is going to have to figure out, an organization that has a lot of pressure really from the top down when you look at the way that they have sort of conducted their business in the past year, something that we will dive into more in our final segment. But final thoughts here on Cleveland versus Orlando. This is going to be one of those matchups where it should be a very close series in my eyes, should be very hard-nosed for all the people that complain about the high-scoring offenses and how it's ruining the game. This should be one of the best series for you to watch, but the reality is that's not going to be the case because people just love to complain. But that being said, I'm going to enjoy this matchup. Orlando, we've seen their level of offensive creation is definitely not at the peak of their powers. Now, Franz Wagner is somebody who has been pretty disappointing this year. If he can find a way to unlock it, and he was showing some flashes yesterday in their game against Milwaukee, if he can elevate his game, it could add a level to this Orlando offense that maybe we feel differently about them as a whole. But an elite defensive group and should be a lot of hard-nosed basketball in this type of a matchup. I would lean with the star power of Cleveland. If you look at last year, something they struggled with was the other team relying, or in the Knicks, that is, in their first round matchup, being able to take advantage of the lack of spacing with Cleveland from both Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen. And on the other side, they were able to shoot themselves. This time, Orlando doesn't necessarily have that same level of a three-point threat where we can see this massive discrepancy. Now, Cleveland definitely going to have to step up more in this year. Last year, the lights were just too bright for them. They were getting out-rebounded as well as being taken advantage of from the perspective of not having that level of spacing and shot creation, which was massively concerning. I think this is a little bit of a make-or-break playoff series for head coach JB Bickerstaff if he wants to remain there. And should be really interesting to see as well the whole Donovan Mitchell element of this, of whether or not he sees himself being able to find success with the Cavs as he heads into sort of the peak of his prime years here in the NBA, approaching free agency in a couple years, so should be very interesting to see. But let me know from both the West and the East what playoff series you guys are most looking forward to. I guess final picks here. I'm taking the Celtics out of the first round. I'm taking the Knicks out of the first round. I have such a hard time with this Bucks and Pacers series. I actually think that I might, in this moment, be leaning towards the Pacers, but could very easily see that going either way. And then I'm going to lean with the Cavs. But let me know what you think as far as your predictions. We are going to be taking our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to be doing a quick segment on this past weekend, starting with yesterday's games, but some of the biggest results that helped impact how we got to this point seeding-wise, and what sort of things were notable to take out of that set of games. So stick with us and we will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just did some overviews of both the Eastern and Western conferences in the previous two segments. Now we are going to be doing a little bit more of a brief segment here, talking about this weekend's NBA games and talking about sort of the biggest storylines to come of them. I referenced it in the first segment of the day, talking about that matchup between the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Phoenix Suns, and the way that we saw the Suns really just dismantle the Timberwolves in this matchup that did have a lot of meaning for the Timberwolves as well. Now, they were a little bit of a long shot to take home that number one seed. They would have needed Oklahoma City to lose, and I can't remember whether or not they had the tiebreaker over Denver. Not that it matters anyways now, but again, I know that Phoenix had some level of desperation that the Wolves couldn't have manufactured themselves, but this was still a little bit alarming, especially taking into consideration the way that this season series has played out, where the Suns have won 3-0, have won pretty convincingly in all of these games, and the way that they were able to get to Anthony Edwards once again in a way that we really haven't seen many teams be able to do so in this season, where, again, for a 26 point per game scorer in Anthony Edwards, he's averaging just 14.3 points per game in these matchups against Phoenix. He actually raised his field goal percentage by going 3 of 7 yesterday, where he is shooting just 31% in these matchups. And again, last night he maybe was deferring a little bit more. Now, this game wasn't necessarily extremely close, so it's not like he went into that killer mode that we've seen in a handful of instances where he takes over down the stretch when the team needs him. Felt like they sort of mailed it in a little bit in the second half, which can be reflected by some of the minutes that these players played. I know that early on in the game they were maybe trying to establish Karl Anthony Towns a little bit more going forward. It's interesting because we saw 2 big-time players for these Western Conference playoff teams try to make their returns in recent games and sort of struggle to fit in, and the offense looking disjointed, both Karl Anthony Towns and yesterday, where we saw the Lakers play the Pelicans in another game where it sort of felt like the Pelicans had a chance to, if they won that game, they would have saved themselves from having to be a part of that play-in tournament, but they end up adding Brandon Ingram to the lineup for the first time in about a month or so. He was dealing with, I believe it was an elbow injury, so he missed a handful of games, and he was fine in his return, but again, just the Pelicans offense as a whole never really looked all that great. And again, in these matchups, I do feel like yesterday's slate was a little bit underwhelming, other than the Knicks and Bulls game was tremendous, but I felt like for a lot of these teams, they understood the playoffs are right on the other side of that stretch, and they didn't want to necessarily overexert themselves in these instances. So not a ton of fight from the Pelicans. That is a little bit concerning with them. Now, we'll see, because these 2 teams in the Lakers and Pelicans are going to match up in the play-in tournament tomorrow night. So should be interesting to see whether or not New Orleans comes back with some other level of intensity. But a pretty sloppy game from them in this instance. Struggled with turnovers, and it was just not super encouraging. Zion Williamson really struggled in this one, and this was coming off of a game against the Warriors where it was a really convincing, very entertaining win for them. So, this has been a team in the NBA this season that has seen tons of highs and lows as the year has progressed, and I do still think that they can be a very competitive team. They are, I wouldn't take them against the Denver Nuggets. I feel like that could be a potential sweep if they were to beat the Lakers and end up as that 7 seed. But for as much as everybody's talking about LA as that 8 seed and how it could be a potential upset against the Thunder, I do think that the Pelicans could also be a team that could really hang with Oklahoma City. And again, I do like OKC, and I almost feel guilty that so many people are sort of looking past this 57-win team that was very fun this season, but at the same time, they are just still so young. Their average age is something like 22 years old, and I just feel like there is a real vulnerability there. We'll see how that plays out. But the Knicks-Bulls game, I wanted to briefly touch on as well. Like I mentioned, an overtime matchup, and this was a Chicago team that was dealing with a handful of different injuries, but were able to sort of fight through it and still push the Knicks to the end. It seemed like during that end of the, at least Eastern, 1 o'clock there yesterday, the games, it was 1 o'clock Eastern and 3:30 Eastern, where you had 15 and 15 games. And we were watching this first half of the games, and it seemed like nobody was really going to steal that number 2 seed, as Milwaukee was losing, but as was Cleveland, who they didn't really play any of their starters, and the Knicks were trailing late in that game and took a little bit of a comeback effort there from Jalen Brunson to get that one done. And yeah, it was weird how that 2 seed was just sitting there for grabs, but ultimately the Knicks were able to take it thanks to another 40 bomb by Jalen Brunson. Like I talked about in the last segment, it is going to be very interesting to see how the conversation surrounding him being All-NBA is. It feels like that the Jason Tate, the 4 spots that are just about locked in are Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Luka Doncic, Nikola Jokic, and Giannis, and that 5th spot is the one that's available. I have argued that I think that it should be Jason Tatum, although Jalen Brunson is a very worthy candidate as well. But what I found interesting was the fact that Doris Burke was actually trying to make the argument that Brunson could overtake Giannis for that final spot, seemingly keeping Tatum in the mix and bumping Giannis out to the second team. I feel like I'm not ready to go to that level. Now, Bucks definitely sort of underachieved during the regular season at least, but we've seen the level of team that they are with and without Giannis, and I just don't think that I can necessarily turn on him like that, especially given the statistics that he's put up this season. But was just a very interesting note, I thought, that she kept going to it really from the time that the game tipped off. She kept saying, if the Knicks end up taking the 2 seed, should it be Giannis that is bumped out of first team? Very interesting discussion there. But like I said, it was Brunson who just, it seems like in all of these fourth quarters, is able to take over for the Knicks and lead them to a very solid 50-win season. First time they've won 50 games in a year in a handful of seasons. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but the way that he's also able to just play this team-centric, I know it's a lot of him creating himself, but he does so in a system that really benefits, and I'm not ready to have the whole discussion right now necessarily of how the fit is alongside of Julius Randle, although I do think that that will be a discussion when the offseason comes along, because it seems like the Knicks offense just flows so well right now. They have Dante DiVincenzo out on the wing, who has really emerged as a massive three-point threat for them. Josh Hart, maybe not quite as much as the three-point shooter, but plays incredibly solid defense, is a massive rebounder for them, and just makes all of the right plays, the backdoor cuts, the smart passes, the hockey assists, all of that. And in terms of catch and shoot, OG Anunoby is one of the best catch and shoot wings in the league, along with playing the elite defense that he does. I just feel like this Knicks team is really shaping into itself, and it is encouraging to see if you are a Knicks fan. Again, going to be an interesting conversation to see how this sort of progresses into the offseason, but obviously right now, they are just focused on trying to capitalize on this opportunity now with the 2 seed that was pretty unexpected to come into this type of a situation, and here they are. But as for the rest of the games from this weekend, I feel like the biggest sort of stories were that Victor Wembanyama performance on Friday night, where he just took over down the stretch, and this is a little bit of a version of Wemby. I don't have a strong opinion necessarily on whether or not Victor Wembanyama should or should not be the defensive player of the year. I feel like the level of production that he had defensively just was not the same level during the beginning of the season when he was playing on minutes restriction, which is, again, depending on how you want to spin it, you can spin it either way. But this was the type of defensive performance, I think, that really impressed me. The way that he was able to limit Jokic, not make things easy, and Jokic finished with a pretty traditional Jokic stat line. But I do feel like in some of these big matchups, specifically, we saw the Jokic-Wemby matchup from a couple weeks ago, and Jokic did as much as Wembanyama had. It was maybe 7 blocks in that game. Jokic was able to get to the rim a handful of these the times that he wanted to and impose his will, but this was a Wemby performance where he was able to lock down the paint. He performed more on the offensive side of the ball where he scored 34 points, and I think that it's probably a reach to put him All-NBA because of, especially, the team success is obviously a massive shortcoming there to try and make that argument. The minutes restriction and availability that he had during the year. But, a lot of the clutch stats with Wemby also have not been great. But in this game, it was him flashing his potential and being able to take over in big moments. And I think that, he gave a quote over the weekend that he said he is at about 15% of where he thinks he'll be from where he started his rookie season to what he expects his prime to be. 15% for a conversation as to whether or not he should be All-NBA and Defensive Player of the Year in that rookie season is already incredible. But again, definitely a lot of very exciting things to see in the future for Wemby. And yeah, he had one of the most memorable rookie seasons, at least that I have ever experienced as a basketball fan. And I feel like it's going to be very tough to top that for some time. But on that note, we are going to be taking our final break of the show. And when we come back on the other end, we will be diving into the conversations around who is under the most pressure for the NBA playoffs, what the biggest storylines are, and everything relating to that. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
Available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the show today. We've been all about the NBA playoffs today, and now we are going to be looking at the biggest storylines headed into the next couple months in the NBA. And I wanted to start by talking about the Milwaukee Bucks. And there's definitely an argument to be made in terms of championship aspirations and the cores and the pressure to succeed this offseason. From a national media standpoint, the Celtics are probably the team under the most pressure, but I do feel like from an organizational standpoint and the turmoil that could build up, I think that the Bucks are actually at biggest risk of having some drastic changes in the future, where we saw them really choose to upend their identity and having some key pieces of the organization see their way out following their upset after getting upset by the Miami Heat in the first round last season. Mind you, this is this was a playoff series where Giannis played only half of the minutes, walked into a Jimmy Butler masterclass where he averaged something close to 40 points per game, probably closer to the 35 mark, but went absolutely berserk in that first round of the playoffs, and they fire both their head coach, Mike Budenholzer, and they decide to make this splash move, trading for Damian Lillard, and in doing so, they move off of Drew Holiday, who was another staple of the Bucks championship team in 2021. Now, I understand that this Lillard move also was in part to try and convince Giannis that the team was convinced on their chances to win moving forward. They were sort of trying to sell Giannis after Giannis sort of gave some hints of, well, maybe I don't end up here my entire career. I want to be in an organization where we're committed to winning. And they go out and swing on a player like Damian Lillard very shortly after Giannis signs his contract extension. So I don't think that that can totally be overlooked as part of this move. But again, a lot of big time changes in the moment there with Budenholzer and Holiday both going out. They bring in Adrian Griffin, who flames out. Again, flames out can be a little bit of an exaggeration. I don't know how you would describe necessarily the Griffin term in Milwaukee. It wasn't about their regular season success because they were winning games, but the locker room did not seem to be bought in necessarily, and it was a very, there was just a lot going on there. They now bring in Doc Rivers, who's been a very polarizing coach amongst the NBA media over these past couple years. He signs I think a multi-year contract with them. I could be wrong about that. Feel free to fact check me if I am. But if they end up getting upset in the first round, let's just say hypothetically to the Pacers, are they making another coaching change? Again, I'll have to look into how long Doc Rivers is going to be with the Bucks, but they could end up having to be, he's on board through the 2026-27 season, I believe, and that means if they were to move on from him, they could be paying 4 head coaches at once. I'm not sure when the Budenholzer money officially expires, but again, tons of money that they've been filing into their head coaches over the past couple years, and they've really sort of limited their flexibility because of this Lillard move. Where do you go from here moving forward in terms of, again, that sort of pressure to succeed? From the media, it is the Boston Celtics, where they've been in this spot a handful of different times, and if they fall again, they probably will have to make some type of move. Not exactly sure what that is, as they did just sign Drew Holiday to a contract extension. Maybe it's firing head coach Joe Mazzulla. Maybe it's a Jaylen Brown trade, which I don't think is very likely after the season that Brown has had. But again, it's a possibility. But as for the Bucks, I feel like it becomes a very dicey situation there. And also on the note of Lillard, I think it's unfair necessarily to sort of put this massive weight on his shoulders as he is getting up there in age. He is 33 years old. He's going to be 34 by the start of next season. So maybe it's unfair probably to, put this massive pressure on him to be the guy to lead them to postseason success. But at the same time, he he stuck around with Portland far longer than he probably should have, and that was out of loyalty, so I'm not going to criticize him over that. But then he did sort of start to make a little bit of a deal of it at the end there, and the Bucks ended up paying a big price to go and get him. And now he is, seen a significant drop-off, and he's in his, a little bit more, I wouldn't say quite twilight years, but he's in the final stretch of his career, and I don't think that he has that same level of being able to single-handedly carry a team to a conference finals like he did with Portland during his prime there, but he is somebody who's probably going to be catching a lot of flack if they don't have postseason success this year, and is just something I'm definitely going to be looking at to see how they decide to manage the pressure in that situation as a whole moving forward. But like I did sort of allude to a couple times there, the Boston Celtics are the team in terms of the media perspective. The number one pressure, is this the season that they actually come through? The Eastern Conference is just about as light as it has been during the tenure of Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. And it's not to say that if they don't win it all this season, their window is closed, because it is very much still open. But the path has never been easier. I think that the only team that realistically should beat them in a series is the Denver Nuggets. But even with that, the Celtics have completely loaded up for this season, and if they don't end up winning it all this year, there's tons of questions about, okay, well, what is actually going to get it done for them? Is Jason Tatum capable of being a number one on a championship team? How does Jaylen Brown fit into the picture long term? And for a very expensive roster, it just becomes a very fascinating conversation moving forward. The other team in the East, again, I wouldn't say pressure-wise necessarily, but I'm just curious to see how much longer can this Jalen Brunson Knicks thing go for them, where the playoff seeding ends up breaking out great for them. I like them against either the 76ers or the Heat, whoever comes out of that play-in tournament. They are equipped defensively to beat either one of them. The Joel Embiid matchup could be difficult, but they do have a rotation of big men in Mitchell Robinson, who's been working his way back from injury, that he could be a big piece there, but Isaiah Hartenstein is really the one who's going to likely get the big minutes for them, and he's been playing very well, but I think they could definitely hold up. And you know, especially if Embiid is limited, Jalen Brunson is probably the best player, at least offensively, in the series for them. How much longer can he carry the Knicks in this fashion, where, as much as I said, the rest of the roster has really developed into their roles in a positive way, it is Jalen Brunson that is the number one option, and the number two, I don't really know who is a creator offensively outside of that. Again, I like the Knicks roster, but the way that they're currently constructed, it was supposed to be Julius Randle, and they're without him. And if there is going to be a moment, especially if they run into a Miami, which would be a very good defensive matchup, I think, between both of these teams, and the Heat's offense isn't the most intimidating thing in the world, but they do have a couple guys on the ball in Terry Rozier and Tyler Hero that can maybe make things work, and that's outside of talking about Jimmy Butler himself. But I think that it's going to be very much on Jalen Brunson's shoulders to carry the Knicks through these first couple rounds here, and a handful of people are going to be picking them to make the finals. I don't know if I'm there, but at the same time, same as I talked about with the Celtics, this is a very open Eastern Conference, and I'm just curious to see Jalen Brunson. This is a massive inflection point as far as, you know, his legacy and just how special this season is. It is special, at least from a vibes perspective, of the fact that he won over the entire state of New York, and he was able to put his stamp on making his first ever All-Star game, and that he deserves to be in these All-NBA considerations. But to, you know, what heights can this reach? Is this just going to be a feel-good story? I talked about earlier how Bill Simmons made the comparison to the Isaiah Thomas season with the Boston Celtics. I think I said 18-19 or something then. It was the 16-17 season, I believe, where Isaiah Thomas was averaging 30 and taking over the fourth quarters, like we've seen Jalen Brunson do in a lot of these big-time games. or is it going to be a flash in the pan, or is this something to stay? Should be very interesting to see. In terms of the Western Conference, I feel like the Clippers storyline is one that a lot of people are sort of shooing off at this point. That it is this collection of sort of aged stars that are past their prime, but it does still feel like, I mean, we saw them even as early as this year during their dominant stretch, that they can be one of the best teams in the league. It's a matter of, though, do you buy into that version of the Clippers or the one that we've seen this post-All-Star break that hasn't been quite as locked in and has definitely staggered at times? I think a lot of people are overlooking the Clippers. I just picked the Mavericks to beat them as well, so I'm partially guilty of this as well. But I'm also not ready to sort of fully turn the page. Can this team stay fully healthy, and what type of damage can they do if that is the case? Or, unfortunately, are we just past that point at this point of all of their careers? Also in the West, I am definitely looking at the historical aspect of the Denver Nuggets and if they're able to pull off the repeat. Felt like last year this is a team that is very much capable of repeating the way that they are built, the way that they still have their same starting five from last year in their core, and the type of offense that they run is just very easy to sort of plug guys into, and that's why we've seen some of these young players be able to develop and thrive in the situation. But we could definitely be having some, all-time legacy conversations. For Jokic, things are what they are anyways, and I don't really want to dive into the player perspective of it because that discourse is always toxic. But for this Nuggets run here, could be, inching towards that dynasty level. Now, typically, it's got to be 3 championships. It wouldn't just be the back-to-back, but they are in a great position both this season and moving forward in my eyes. And they're the best team in the league as I currently see things. So definitely curious about that. And then the last thing is the idea of, are we going to see any of these young stars fully emerge? We at length talked about the idea of who was the next face of the NBA around the All-Star break. You have 2 of those prime candidates, and really 3 even if you want to include Jason Tatum from the East, but Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Anthony Edwards. And again, if you want to throw Tatum in that conversation, 3 players on top seeds in their conferences with very solid chances to make some noise during the postseason and emerge as the next big candidate for the face of the league. I think that Anthony Edwards probably has the closest chance as things currently stand, but winning obviously plays a big part of it. Oklahoma City is possibly a year away in my eyes, but, he could definitely, SGA that is, could have his coming out party with a big time performance, especially if they do end up getting matched up against the Lakers and everybody counts them out and he, dominates his way into a postseason run here. Could be very interesting. There is also another name that I didn't even mention in that top 3 is the fact that Luka Doncic, I know it feels like he's, been in the NBA longer than he has just because from the minute he's came into the league, he's been so good. But if he's able to lead some sort of a run with the Mavericks as well, we could be having some conversations with him as well. But let me know what you are looking forward to most in the upcoming NBA playoffs. We will be providing tons of in-depth coverage as the games progress here. But for now, we are going to be ending the show. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. We are live from 2 to 3 Eastern every weekday. So we will be back tomorrow afternoon, and we will see you then. Thanks for tuning in.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.